You raised one successful child and one lifelong disappointment, my mother said into the microphone at their 40th anniversary party. And the worst part wasn't the words. It was the sound of everyone laughing afterward. The ballroom at the Lakeside Country Club was warm with soft lighting and the gentle clink of champagne glasses, the kind of place where families usually gathered to celebrate love that had lasted decades. But in that moment it felt like every light in the room was pointed directly at me. I was standing near the back of the hall with a small plate of roast chicken and green beans that I suddenly had no appetite for, watching my parents at the center of the room beneath a gold banner that read, 40 wonderful years. My father held my mother's hand proudly while she smiled out at nearly 100 guests, neighbors, church friends, business partners, and relatives, people who had watched my brother and me grow up. My older brother, Michael, stood beside them in a tailored navy suit, already raising his glass as if the speech had been charming instead of cruel. The laughter spread across the room like a ripple on water, polite at first, then louder, as if everyone believed they were supposed to find the joke funny. I stood there with the strange feeling that the floor had shifted slightly under my feet. For 68 years I had been part of this family, and suddenly I felt like a stranger who had wandered into someone else's celebration. I could see familiar faces turning toward me, some with awkward smiles, others pretending not to notice at all. My mother lifted her glass again and added something about how every family had one child who never quite figured life out. And I heard another round of chuckles echo through the room. I set my plate down on the nearest table and walked quietly toward the hallway that led to the exit. No one stopped me. No one called my name. The music from the small jazz band continued as if nothing unusual had happened, a smooth trumpet melody floating behind me while I crossed the polished marble lobby and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The parking lot overlooked the lake, and the water was dark except for the reflection of the country club's lights. I stood there for a moment with my car, keys in my hand, trying to understand how a celebration of 40 years of marriage had turned into a public reminder that I apparently didn't belong in the family story anymore. It wasn't the first time I had felt that quiet distance growing between me and my parents, but it was the first time they had said it out loud in front of everyone. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away slowly, watching the building shrink in the rearview mirror. The laughter from that room stayed with me the entire 15-mile drive home, echoing in my mind like a question I couldn't yet answer. How had I become the disappointment in a family where I had spent my entire life trying to be enough? I drove home along the quiet highway with both hands on the steering wheel, the lights from the country club slowly disappearing behind me until the road was dark except for the steady glow of my headlights. The drive back to my small house outside Brookfield usually took about 20 minutes, but that night it felt longer because my mind kept replaying the sound of that laughter again and again. My mother had always been sharp with her words, but she usually kept those comments inside the walls of our home where only family could hear them. Tonight she had chosen a room full of people. Friends, neighbors, business partners, people who had watched me grow up from a quiet girl who loved books into a woman who spent 40 years working as a public school librarian. I kept asking myself the same question while the road stretched out in front of me. When had I become the disappointment? The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. The porch light flicked on automatically as I stepped out of the car, casting a warm circle across the wooden steps. I unlocked the door and walked inside, setting my purse on the kitchen counter out of habit before taking off my coat. The silence inside the house felt heavy but familiar. I had lived alone here for 8 years since my husband, Thomas, passed away. Usually the quiet comforted me. Tonight it only gave my thoughts more room to echo. I poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the small calendar on the wall. The anniversary party had been planned for months. My brother Michael had organized everything. The invitations, the music, the decorations, the elegant ballroom overlooking the lake. He had called me 3 weeks earlier to make sure I would attend. "Do not forget to come, Margaret," he had said with a cheerful voice. "It will mean a lot to Mom and Dad if the whole family is there." I believed him. I even bought my mother a silver picture frame engraved with the date of their wedding day in 1984. The gift was still sitting in my purse because I had not had a chance to give it to her before the speech began. I opened the purse slowly and looked at the small box resting inside. The engraving suddenly felt painfully ironic. 40 wonderful years. I leaned back in the chair and tried to think about the years that had led to this moment. It had not always been like this. When Michael and I were children, my parents had seemed proud of both of us. But somewhere along the way the balance had shifted. Michael became the successful one, the one who started a consulting company and moved into a large home in the suburbs, the one who hosted holiday dinners and made business deals on the golf course with our father. I had chosen a quieter life. I taught children how to read. I organized school book fairs. I spent evenings grading papers and weekends helping neighbors with their gardens. It had never seemed like a failure to me. Yet tonight, standing in that ballroom, I realized that my parents had been measuring our lives with a completely different ruler. I finished the glass of water and set it carefully beside the sink. The clock on the microwave read 10:32. The party was probably still going on. More speeches, more laughter, more photographs of the perfect family celebrating a perfect marriage. I walked to the living room and sat in the armchair by the window where Thomas used to read every evening. The street outside was quiet except for the occasional car passing by. For a long time I sat there thinking about my mother's voice over the microphone and the way the guests had turned toward me. That moment had felt like a door closing. And once a door closes like that, sometimes the only thing left to do is decide whether you are going to keep knocking or simply walk away. I did not sleep much that night. The house stayed quiet around me while the clock in the hallway ticked steadily past midnight, then 1 in the morning, then 2. Every time I closed my eyes I saw the ballroom again, the soft gold lights, the glasses raised in celebration, and my mother smiling into the microphone as if humiliating her own daughter were part of the entertainment. At some point I stood up from the armchair and walked into the kitchen, more out of habit than hunger, and turned on the small lamp above the counter. The light fell across the neat rows of mail that I had not opened yet. Bills, a gardening catalog, a postcard from an old friend in Arizona. Normal things. Ordinary life continuing exactly the same way it had the day before. I poured another glass of water and looked out the window toward the backyard. The oak tree Thomas planted 20 years earlier moved gently in the night breeze, its branches casting long shadows across the grass. He used to say that trees were patient witnesses. They stood through storms and quiet summers alike, watching families grow and change around them. I wondered what that old tree would say if it could speak about the years it had seen here. Because the truth was that my mother's words had not come from nowhere. They were the loudest moment in a pattern that had been building for a long time. The first memory that surfaced was from Christmas 6 years earlier. My brother Michael had hosted dinner at his large house outside Chicago, the kind of place with high ceilings and a grand staircase in the foyer. I had arrived with a homemade apple pie and a stack of small gifts for the children. My mother hugged Michael first, then his wife, then the grandchildren. When she finally turned to me, she said with a thin smile that I should have called before coming, so she could set an extra place at the table. Everyone laughed lightly, as if it were harmless humor. I laughed too, because sometimes it is easier to pretend that something is a joke. Another memory followed close behind. My retirement party from the school district 3 years ago. 40 years of teaching children how to read. The principal had arranged a small ceremony in the library where I spent most of my career. Teachers brought flowers and former students sent letters thanking me for helping them discover their love of books. My brother came for 10 minutes and spent most of that time answering messages on his phone. My mother told one of the parents standing nearby that librarians had easy jobs compared to people who worked in real businesses. I remember smiling and saying nothing because I did not want to ruin the moment for everyone else. Sitting at the kitchen table in the quiet hours before dawn, I began to see those memories differently. At the time they had seemed like small cuts, easy to ignore if I stayed calm and patient. But when you place enough small moments together, they begin to form a picture that is impossible to overlook. By 4:30 in the morning, the sky outside had started to turn pale gray. I had not turned on the television or the radio. The only sound in the house was the refrigerator humming softly in the corner. I realized then that the anniversary party had simply been the first time the truth was spoken loudly enough for everyone to hear. And once the truth becomes that clear, you cannot pretend that you misunderstood it. I watched the sun rise from the kitchen window without realizing how long I had been standing there. The sky slowly turned from gray to pale blue, and the quiet neighborhood outside began to wake up. A delivery truck rolled past the house across the street. Someone started a lawn mower in the distance. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning. Yet inside my mind, everything felt different, as if a long story I had been telling myself for years had finally ended. Around 7 in the morning, my phone rang on the kitchen counter. I looked at the screen before answering and saw my brother's name, Michael Whitmore. I let it ring once more before picking up. His voice sounded irritated in the way it often did when something had not gone according to his expectations. He did not ask if I had made it home safely. He did not mention the speech our mother had given the night before. Instead, he went straight to the point. He said that Mom had been upset after I left the party early and that several guests had noticed my absence. He said it looked bad when family members walked out of important celebrations. I listened quietly while he spoke, the phone pressed against my ear, watching a pair of sparrows hop across the backyard fence. When he finished, I asked a simple question. I asked if he had heard what Mom said during the toast. There was a short silence on the line before he answered. Michael gave a small laugh and said that everyone knew Mom liked to tease people and that I should not take things so seriously. He reminded me that the evening had been about celebrating 40 years of marriage and that I should not make it about myself. The words settled over me slowly, not cruel in tone, but dismissive in a way that felt even colder. I thanked him for calling and told him I needed to start my day. Then I ended the conversation before he could continue explaining why my feelings were inconvenient. After the call, I placed the phone back on the counter and stood there thinking about how easily the story had already changed. In Michael's version, I had been the one who caused a problem by leaving. My mother's speech had become a harmless joke. The room full of laughter had become proof that everyone understood it that way except me. I walked to the living room and opened the curtains, letting the early sunlight spill across the wooden floor. For many years I had tried to keep peace in this family by adjusting my reactions. When someone made a cutting remark, I told myself they did not mean it. When invitations arrived late or not at all, I assumed it was a misunderstanding. But the quiet clarity of that morning made something obvious that I had ignored for too long. Peace built on silence is not really peace at all. It is simply the absence of honesty. I returned to the kitchen and picked up the small silver picture frame that I had meant to give my parents the night before. The engraved date of their wedding glinted softly in the light. I ran my finger across the numbers and wondered how two people who spent 40 years building a life together could still misunderstand their own daughter so completely. Then I placed the frame back inside the box and set it gently on the table. For the first time since leaving the party, I felt something other than confusion. It was not anger, and it was not sadness. It was the quiet realization that if a family refuses to see you clearly, there comes a moment when you must decide whether to keep trying to convince them or finally accept that their version of you will never change. I spent the rest of that morning moving slowly through the house, not because I had anything urgent to do, but because routine has a way of steadying the mind when everything else feels unsettled. I washed the single glass sitting beside the sink and placed it back on the drying rack. I watered the small fern that sat on the kitchen windowsill. The sunlight had fully risen now, filling the rooms with a soft brightness that made the house feel almost peaceful again. Yet beneath that calm, I felt a quiet shift inside myself, something subtle but undeniable, like a compass needle turning toward a new direction. Around mid-morning, I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The air was cool and fresh, the kind of clear autumn morning that makes the leaves look brighter than usual. I followed the same path I had walked hundreds of times before, down the sidewalk past the white fence on Elm Street, and around the small park where children usually played in the afternoons. As I walked, I thought about the years that had shaped my relationship with my parents. For most of my life, I had believed that patience could solve almost anything. When someone misunderstood you, you explained more carefully. When someone treated you unfairly, you waited for them to realize their mistake. That belief had guided many of my choices, both as a teacher and as a daughter. But patience only works when the other person is willing to listen. If someone has already decided who you are in their story, no amount of explanation will rewrite the role they assigned you. By the time I returned home, the clock in the living room read a little after 11. I made a cup of tea and sat down at the small desk near the window where I usually paid my bills and sorted through paperwork. On the corner of the desk sat a stack of documents I had not looked at in months, mostly letters from the school district about my retirement benefits and a few financial statements from an investment account my father had helped me open many years earlier. I reached for the top envelope without thinking too much about it and began reading through the pages slowly. The numbers and formal language did not interest me very much at first. But one detail caught my attention in a way that made me pause. The account listed both my name and my father's name as joint holders. I frowned slightly and flipped through the rest of the statement. I remembered signing a few papers with him long ago when he said he was helping me set up a simple savings account for the future. At the time, I trusted him completely and did not study the documents very carefully. Now, sitting alone at the desk with the quiet morning light falling across the pages, I realized I did not fully understand what the account actually contained or how it had been used over the years. That thought lingered in my mind longer than I expected. I placed the papers back on the desk and leaned back in the chair, staring out the window toward the backyard again. The oak tree stood exactly where it always had, steady and unmoving. But for the first time, I wondered how many things in my life had quietly grown in directions I never thought to question. The anniversary party had revealed something painful about my family, but as I sat there with those financial statements in front of me, I began to sense that it might also have uncovered something else entirely. Sometimes the moment that finally pushes you away from a familiar place is the same moment that forces you to look more closely at everything you once assumed was simple. I sat at the desk longer than I expected, the financial statement still open in front of me, while the late morning sunlight slowly shifted across the wooden surface. At first, the numbers seemed ordinary, the kind of small investment account many parents help their children create. But the more I read, the more the details began to feel unfamiliar. Several transfers had been made over the past few years. Not large ones, but consistent. Each one was authorized under the joint access that my father had originally set up. I tried to remember the last time we had actually discussed that account. It had probably been more than a decade ago, back when my husband Thomas was still alive and my parents visited for Sunday dinners every few weeks. My father had always liked to talk about financial responsibility. He believed careful planning was the sign of a disciplined life. At the time, I admired that about him. I trusted his advice without hesitation. Now, sitting there alone in the quiet house, I realized how little attention I had paid to the details of what I signed all those years ago. The thought made me uneasy in a quiet, thoughtful way rather than a panicked one. I stood up, walked to the filing cabinet near the hallway, and pulled open the second drawer where I kept older documents. The folders inside were arranged neatly by year. Insurance forms, tax records, retirement letters from the school district. After a few minutes of searching, I found the folder labeled with the date my father had helped me open the account. The paperwork inside looked exactly the way I remembered it. Formal language printed in neat columns, lines marked for signatures that I had written without much hesitation at the time. I sat back down at the desk and began reading the pages slowly. The structure of the account was more complicated than I had realized. It was not simply a savings account with my name on it. It allowed both holders to move funds, authorize transactions, and manage linked investments connected to several other accounts. Some of those linked accounts did not even appear on the statements I received each year. I leaned back in the chair and folded my hands together, thinking carefully about what that meant. My father had always been extremely organized about financial matters. If these arrangements existed, he would have known exactly how they worked. The quiet question that formed in my mind was not dramatic or angry. It was simply curious. Why had he never explained the full structure to me? The clock in the living room ticked steadily while I sat there reviewing the documents again. Eventually, I picked up the phone and looked through my contacts until I found the name of a small local bank branch listed on the statement. I had not visited that branch in years, but the address was only about 15 minutes away by car. For a moment, I considered calling first, but then I set the phone down again. Sometimes a conversation is easier when you sit across from another person rather than speaking through a receiver. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back into the filing cabinet, then returned to the desk and gathered the recent statements into a neat stack. The anniversary party still lingered in my memory like an echo, but the feeling inside me had begun to change. The hurt from my mother's words was still there, yet something else had quietly taken its place beside it. A sense that there were pieces of my own story I had never taken the time to examine closely. As I stood up and reached for my coat, I realized that the next step was not about confronting anyone or proving anyone wrong. It was about understanding something that should have been clear to me long ago. The bank branch sat on the corner of Maple Avenue and 3rd Street, a modest brick building with wide glass windows that reflected the bright midday sun. I parked my car in the nearly empty lot and sat there for a moment with the folder resting on the passenger seat beside me. The world outside looked perfectly ordinary. A man walked past the entrance carrying a cup of coffee. A young woman pushed open the door while checking something on her phone. Nothing about the place suggested that the documents inside my folder might hold answers to questions I had never thought to ask before. I stepped out of the car, straightened my coat, and walked inside. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. Behind the front desk, a teller greeted me with a polite smile and asked how she could help. I explained that I had a joint account connected to my name and my father's name and that I wanted to understand the details more clearly. She nodded and directed me toward a small office along the side hallway where a branch representative could review the records with me. The man who greeted me introduced himself as Daniel Carter. He looked to be in his early 40s, professional but approachable, the kind of person who had spent many years explaining financial information to people who did not work with numbers every day. I handed him the statements from the folder and told him that my father had originally helped me open the account many years earlier. Daniel studied the pages quietly for a moment before typing something into his computer. The clicking of the keyboard filled the small office while the system pulled up the account history. After a few seconds, he leaned slightly closer to the screen, his expression thoughtful rather than concerned. Then he turned the monitor so that I could see it as well. What appeared on the screen was more complex than I expected. The account I knew about was only one part of a larger network of linked financial accounts connected through the same authorization structure. Several of them had been active for many years. Others had been added more recently. Daniel explained calmly that the structure allowed one authorized holder to manage funds that moved between different investment pools. He pointed to a section showing transfers made over the past decade. Some of the amounts were modest. Others were much larger. I listened carefully while he described the flow of those transactions. None of it sounded illegal or alarming. Everything had been processed through legitimate financial channels. Yet there was one detail that made me sit a little straighter in my chair. According to the records, my name appeared as the primary holder connected to several of the larger investment accounts. My father's name was listed as an authorized manager. For years I had assumed the situation was the opposite. Daniel glanced at me when he noticed my silence. I explained that I had always believed my father controlled the account completely and that I had simply signed papers to make things easier for him. Daniel shook his head gently and clarified that the documentation showed something different. Legally speaking, the structure placed the ownership authority under my name while allowing another person to assist with management. The explanation was delivered in a calm, professional tone, but the meaning settled into my mind slowly. For a long time, I had been treated as if I contributed very little to the family story. Yet the quiet records on that screen suggested that part of the financial foundation connected to our family name might actually have been built under my own. I sat there absorbing the information while the hum of the office computer filled the room, realizing that sometimes the truth about your place in the world does not appear in loud arguments or dramatic moments. Sometimes it waits quietly in documents that no one expects you to read closely. I remained seated in the small office for several moments after Daniel finished explaining the structure of the accounts, watching the lines of numbers on the screen as if they might rearrange themselves into something simpler if I stared long enough. The information was not dramatic in the way family arguments are dramatic. There were no raised voices and no accusations. Yet the quiet clarity of those records carried a weight that felt just as powerful. For years I had assumed that the financial decisions connected to my family were made entirely by my father and occasionally by my brother Michael. I had always been the quiet daughter who worked in a school library, the one who supposedly never understood business or money the way the rest of them did. That image had been repeated often enough that even I had started to believe it. Daniel scrolled slowly through the transaction history and explained how several of the investment accounts had grown over time. Many of the earliest deposits dated back more than 20 years. Some were connected to savings bonds that had originally been placed under my name when I was younger. Others had been transferred from small investments my husband Thomas and I made during the years when we carefully saved part of every paycheck. My father had apparently combined those assets into a broader investment structure that allowed the funds to expand gradually through long-term planning. Daniel spoke in the calm voice of someone explaining a familiar system, but with every sentence the picture in my mind became clearer. The accounts were not symbolic or ceremonial. They were substantial, quietly substantial. I asked him a few careful questions about access and authorization, making sure I understood exactly what the documents meant. He confirmed that the legal ownership remained tied primarily to my name, even though my father had been managing the structure for many years. If I wished to review or adjust any part of it, the bank could assist me with the process. There was nothing unusual about a person deciding to become more directly involved in accounts that were already under their authority. I nodded, slowly while he spoke, absorbing each explanation. For a long time, I had believed that the distance between me and my family came from my lack of ambition or financial success. My mother's speech at the anniversary celebration had reinforced that idea in the most public way possible. Yet the quiet records in front of me suggested that the story might be more complicated than anyone had admitted. I thanked Daniel for taking the time to walk through the details with me. Before leaving, I asked him to print copies of the most recent account summaries so that I could study them more carefully at home. He gathered the documents neatly and handed them across the desk. The stack felt heavier than its size suggested, perhaps because of what it represented. As I walked out of the bank and stepped back into the bright afternoon sunlight, I realized that something inside me had shifted again. The pain from the anniversary party was still there, but it no longer felt like the center of the story. Instead, it had become the moment that pushed me to look more closely at a part of my life I had ignored for too long. When I reached my car, I placed the documents carefully on the passenger seat beside me. The quiet engine started with a familiar hum, and as I drove away from the bank, I understood that knowledge itself can change the balance of a situation long before anyone says a single word about it. The drive home from the bank felt different from the drive that morning. The same streets stretched out in front of me, the same storefronts and quiet intersections, yet my thoughts had shifted into a calmer and more deliberate rhythm. The documents resting on the passenger seat seemed to carry a quiet gravity, not because they promised conflict or confrontation, but because they offered clarity. For many years I had accepted a certain narrative about my place in the family. I was the quiet daughter who chose a modest career, the one who supposedly never understood the world of investments and business discussions that filled my father and brother's conversations. I had allowed that description to settle into my identity without questioning it very closely. But the information I had just seen at the bank suggested something very different. By the time I reached my driveway, the afternoon sun had begun to angle lower across the neighborhood. I carried the folder inside and placed it on the kitchen table where the morning light had first revealed those statements to me. The house was still peaceful and still familiar, but my attention now focused entirely on the stack of papers in front of me. I sat down, poured another glass of water, and began reading through the documents carefully from the beginning. The printed summaries showed a steady pattern of growth over the years. Small investments from decades earlier had expanded into a larger portfolio that included bonds, managed funds, and several accounts connected to long-term planning structures. None of it had appeared in dramatic headlines or family discussions. It had simply grown quietly in the background while life continued with its ordinary routines. As I reviewed the transaction history again, I began to notice something else. Most of the transfers had occurred at regular intervals, suggesting careful planning rather than spontaneous decisions. My father had clearly managed the accounts with attention and discipline. That realization brought an unexpected mixture of gratitude and curiosity. If he had been responsible for guiding the investments, why had he allowed the rest of the family to believe that I had no understanding of financial matters at all? I leaned back in the chair and considered the question slowly. Perhaps it had simply been easier for everyone to keep their roles simple. Michael the successful businessman, my father the careful planner, and me the quiet teacher who stayed outside those conversations. Roles have a way of becoming comfortable even when they are not completely accurate. But comfort does not always equal truth. I gathered the documents into a neat stack again and placed them back inside the folder. Then I walked to the living room window and looked out at the backyard where the old oak tree stood in the same steady place it had always occupied. A gentle breeze moved through its branches, scattering a few early autumn leaves across the grass. For years I had tried to maintain harmony in my family by ignoring small contradictions and quiet doubts. Now those doubts had turned into clear information that could no longer be overlooked. Yet I did not feel any urgency to confront anyone about it immediately. Instead, I felt something quieter and stronger. A growing understanding of my own position in a story that had been told incorrectly for a long time. The anniversary party had revealed one version of how my family saw me, but the records inside that folder suggested another version entirely, one that had been waiting patiently in the background for someone to notice it. I did not contact anyone in my family for the rest of that week. The silence was not dramatic, and it was not meant as punishment. It simply felt necessary. Every day followed a calm and familiar rhythm. I woke early, made coffee, and spent the morning reading through the financial documents again with a careful and patient mind. The numbers slowly became easier to understand the more time I gave them. Patterns appeared that I had not noticed during my first review. Transfers connected to long-term bonds. Growth inside investment funds that had quietly accumulated for more than 2 decades. Some of the earliest deposits came from savings Thomas and I had set aside when we were still paying off the mortgage on this house. At the time, those contributions had felt small. Now they had grown into something steady and significant through years of patient planning. The realization did not fill me with pride or anger. Instead, it gave me a sense of quiet grounding. For most of my life, I had allowed other people to define the story of my choices. My parents spoke about success in terms of visible achievements, business deals, expensive homes, recognition in public conversations. My own life had followed a quieter path that rarely attracted that kind of attention. Teaching children to read did not produce headlines or large gatherings at country clubs. But the stability of those years had built something meaningful in its own way. One afternoon, I organized the documents into labeled folders so that everything would be easier to reference later. I placed copies of the bank summaries, the original authorization papers, and the recent transaction reports into separate sections. The process felt methodical and calming, almost like preparing a lesson plan the way I used to when I worked at the school library. While I worked, I thought again about the anniversary celebration and the words my mother had spoken into the microphone. The memory still carried a sharp edge, but it no longer felt overwhelming. Instead, it seemed like a doorway that had led me into a clearer understanding of my own life. Toward the end of the week, my phone rang again while I was arranging the last folder. The screen displayed my brother's name, Michael Whitmore. I watched it ring for a moment before answering. His voice sounded more controlled than the previous call, as if he had rehearsed what he wanted to say. He told me that our parents were planning a small family dinner the following weekend, and that they expected me to attend. He mentioned the anniversary party briefly, describing it as a misunderstanding that everyone should move past. I listened without interrupting, the folder still resting open on the desk beside me. When he finished speaking, I told him calmly that I would think about the invitation and let him know later. My answer seemed to surprise him because he paused before responding. For many years, I had automatically agreed to every request that involved family gatherings, even when those events left me feeling invisible afterward. This time I did not rush to reassure him. After we ended the call, I placed the phone down and looked again at the organized stack of documents in front of me. The coming dinner suddenly felt less like a routine family visit and more like a moment where different versions of the same story might finally meet each other in the same room. I did not yet know exactly what I would say when that time arrived. But for the first time in many years, I felt prepared to speak from a place of understanding rather than quiet uncertainty. The following days passed with a calm that felt almost unusual compared to the tension that had surrounded the anniversary celebration. I continued my quiet routine at home, organizing documents and reading through the financial statements again, not because I still felt confused, but because understanding something important deserves patience. Each review confirmed the same clear fact. The accounts connected to my name represented years of steady growth and careful management. They were not symbolic records or small savings plans. They were substantial assets that had been quietly developing while the rest of the family believed I had little involvement in anything related to money. By Friday afternoon, I placed the folders neatly into a leather briefcase that had once belonged to Thomas. I had not used it in years, but the simple act of arranging those papers inside it felt appropriate. That evening, my brother called again to confirm the family dinner for Saturday night at my parents' house. His tone sounded lighter this time, almost cheerful, as if he assumed everything had already returned to normal. I told him I would attend. When I ended the call, I stood by the living room window for a long moment, watching the sun sink slowly behind the oak tree in the backyard. I realized that the dinner would not be about confrontation or anger. It would simply be an opportunity for truth to exist in the same room as the version of the story my family had been telling for years. Saturday arrived with cool autumn air and a pale blue sky. I drove the familiar 20-mile route to my parents' home just before 6 in the evening. Their house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, the same place where Michael and I had grown up. The porch light was already on when I walked up the steps. Through the front window, I could see my mother moving around the dining room table, while my father sat in his usual chair near the fireplace. When I stepped inside, they greeted me politely, though the atmosphere felt cautious in the way families sometimes behave after an uncomfortable event. My brother arrived a few minutes later with his wife, and soon everyone gathered around the table for dinner. The conversation began with ordinary topics: weather, local news, Michael's work schedule. No one mentioned the anniversary party directly. I listened quietly while they spoke, noticing how easily the evening tried to return to its usual rhythm. After the plates were cleared, my father leaned back in his chair and asked if everyone wanted coffee. When he stood up to walk toward the kitchen, I opened the briefcase beside my chair and placed the folder of documents gently on the table. The motion caught their attention without any dramatic announcement. My father paused halfway across the room and looked back at me with a puzzled expression. I spoke calmly, explaining that I had spent the week reviewing some financial records connected to the accounts he helped establish years ago. My voice remained steady as I described the information I had learned during my visit to the bank. There was no accusation in my tone and no anger in my words. I simply described the structure of the investments and the fact that my name appeared as the primary holder across several accounts. The room became quiet as the details settled into the conversation. My brother glanced at the papers with visible surprise, while my mother looked from one face to another, trying to understand how this information fit into the story she believed about me. I continued speaking slowly, not to challenge them, but to make something clear that had never been said out loud before. For many years the family had spoken about success as if it belonged only to one person in the room. Yet the quiet records inside that folder showed that the reality was far more balanced than anyone had realized. The room remained quiet for several long seconds after I finished speaking. My father slowly returned to his chair, his eyes moving from the documents on the table to my face, as if he were seeing something he had not expected to see before. My brother leaned forward and picked up one of the printed statements, scanning the numbers with a growing look of confusion. My mother sat perfectly still, her coffee cup untouched in front of her. The silence did not feel hostile, but it carried the weight of realization. For years our family conversations had followed a familiar pattern where certain roles were assumed without question. My brother was the one everyone praised for his financial success. I was the one people politely overlooked when business topics appeared. Now those quiet papers had interrupted that pattern without any raised voices or dramatic accusations. My father finally cleared his throat and asked how I had obtained the documents. I explained calmly that I had visited the bank branch listed on the statements and asked a representative to help me understand the structure of the accounts we had created years earlier. I reminded him that he had originally encouraged me to sign those authorization papers so that the investments could grow over time. He nodded slowly as the memory returned. The explanation seemed to shift something in the room. My brother looked at my father and asked why he had never mentioned that the accounts were under my name. My father took a long breath before answering. He said that when the investments were first organized, it seemed simpler to place them in my name for certain tax advantages and planning strategies. At the time, he expected to continue managing them quietly while the funds matured. He glanced toward me with a thoughtful expression and admitted that he had never expected the accounts to grow as steadily as they had over the years. My mother listened carefully while he spoke, her earlier confidence slowly replaced by a more reflective silence. The conversation that followed did not become heated or defensive. Instead, it moved gradually toward a clearer understanding of the situation. I explained that my purpose in bringing the documents to dinner was not to embarrass anyone or prove a point. I simply wanted everyone to see the full picture of the story that had been told about me for so long. The same calm tone I used seemed to lower the tension in the room. My brother placed the statement back on the table and admitted that he had always assumed the investments belonged entirely to our father. My father then looked directly at me and acknowledged that I had trusted him for many years without asking questions, something he now recognized as a sign of respect rather than ignorance. For the first time since the anniversary party, the conversation felt honest instead of performative. The labels that had been casually repeated in the past began to lose their certainty. I watched their expressions change as the quiet facts settled into place, realizing that sometimes the most powerful response to humiliation is not anger or revenge, but simply allowing the truth to stand in the center of the room where everyone can see it clearly. I remained seated at the table for a while after the conversation settled into silence again, watching the soft light from the dining room lamp reflect off the papers spread across the wood surface. No one rushed to speak immediately. The moment did not feel like victory or defeat. It felt like something quieter and more honest, the kind of pause that happens when a long-standing assumption finally gives way to a clearer understanding. My father eventually folded his hands together and looked at me with a seriousness I had not seen in him for many years. Match reality. His voice carried a hint of reflection rather than defensiveness. My brother nodded slowly while studying the statements again, as if recalculating something he had never questioned before. My mother remained quiet longer than anyone else. When she finally spoke, her tone was softer than the confident voice she had used at the anniversary celebration. She said she had never realized how much responsibility had been placed under my name when the investments were first organized. I listened without interrupting, noticing how the atmosphere in the room had shifted from casual certainty to careful attention. For many years I had responded to uncomfortable family moments by remaining silent or changing the subject. This time I simply allowed the conversation to continue naturally, without trying to repair anyone's pride or soften the facts. The truth itself was calm enough. I explained that my purpose was not to change the past or demand apologies. The anniversary celebration had already happened, and the words spoken that evening could not be erased. But understanding the full picture of my life mattered to me, not because I needed recognition, but because every person deserves to be seen clearly by the people who claim to know them best. My father eventually gathered the documents together and slid them gently back across the table toward me. He said that if the accounts were legally under my authority, then the decisions about their future should belong to me as well. I thanked him and placed the papers back into the briefcase without making any dramatic announcement about what I would do next. Some choices are better made quietly over time rather than in the middle of a family dinner. When the evening ended, I stepped outside into the cool night air and walked toward my car parked along the curb. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had every time I visited during the past 40 years. The same porch lights glowing softly. The same tall trees lining the street. Then one quiet moment arrives when the truth finally becomes visible, not through arguments or anger, but through simple understanding. That night, as I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, I realized that walking away from humiliation had not been the end of my place in the story. It had simply been the moment when I finally began writing my own.